The late summer sun hung lazily in the sky, spilling its warmth over my sister's backyard in Des Moines. The grill hissed and crackled as burgers seared, and the air smelled of charcoal, sweet corn, and barbecue sauce. Kids ran between lawn chairs, chasing each other with sticky popsicle hands, their laughter blending with the country music playing low from a portable speaker. On the surface, it looked like one of those postcard American evenings, neighbors chatting, relatives smiling, everyone pretending life was uncomplicated. But I've lived long enough to know that family tension has a way of slipping into even the sunniest afternoons. I balanced a paper plate on my lap, smiling politely at a neighbor's story about fishing at Gray's Lake, though my mind drifted. At 36, I'd built a life I was proud of. Nursing at the hospital wasn't easy, but I'd earned respect there. Patients listened when I spoke. Colleagues trusted my judgment. Yet in this yard, I was always the youngest sister, the one without children, the one whose voice carried less weight. Morwenna, my older sister, stood like a queen beside the grill, spatula in hand, hair pulled back neatly, her teacher's voice carrying as she barked light-hearted orders to her son, Quenric. At 12, he already carried the swagger of someone who'd never truly been told no. He darted around the yard, loud and brash, words slipping out of his mouth faster than anyone could correct them. Our mother, Osmera, sat comfortably in a lawn chair, sipping lemonade, her eyes following him fondly but never sternly. She'd always been the quiet watcher, rarely interfering, especially when Morwenna was involved. I told myself to breathe, to soak in the good parts, the sizzling food, the hum of conversation. But inside I felt the warning crackle of sparks. Family respect, I knew, could vanish faster than the smoke rising from a grill. The moment came suddenly, slicing through the cheerful buzz like a blade. Quenric shouted across the yard, calling another boy an idiot loud enough for everyone to hear. Laughter stopped mid-breath. A couple of neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. My nurse's instinct kicked in before my mind could argue. "Hey, language matters, kiddo," I said gently, setting down my plate. Words shape how people see you. I expected a nod, maybe even a shrug. Instead, I felt my sister's eyes pierce through me. Morwenna strode closer, her voice sharp, cutting the air. "Don't lecture my kids, Athalie. You don't have children. You wouldn't understand." The silence after her words pressed down heavy, thicker than the August heat. Faces turned away, pretending to sip from cups, adjusting folding chairs. I held her gaze, my chest tight. "Respect isn't about being a parent," I answered quietly, steady. "It's about being human." She smirked, tugging Quenric toward her side. "He's fine." "Kids are kids. You're overreacting." Her dismissal stung sharper than the words themselves. Not just silenced, but reduced, again, to the outsider, the childless aunt whose voice didn't carry weight. I swallowed it down, forcing my lips into a polite line. Inside, though, I cataloged it. Like I did at the hospital when patients ignored instructions until the pain became too much. Sometimes lessons came late, but they came. The evening pressed on with forced laughter and clinking plates, but a fissure had opened, one that would not close easily. When the sun dipped low and the citronella candles flickered on tables, the teasing began. Quenric, surrounded by his cousins, puffed up his chest and mimicked my voice. "Language matters, kiddo," he sang in a high-pitched tone, overemphasizing each word. The children howled with laughter, rolling on the grass, nudging each other. Instead of correcting him, Morwenna chuckled, shaking her head like it was harmless fun. I forced a smile, my hands tightening around a plastic cup. My chest burned, but I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Across the lawn, I caught sight of our mother lowering her gaze, fiddling with her napkin, avoiding the scene. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some whispering, some choosing to laugh along, unwilling to be the one to speak up. Inside my mind, a quote surfaced, unbidden, from Mark Twain. "It's better to keep your mouth shut and appear stupid than open it and remove all doubt." Tonight, I wasn't the fool in silence. Tonight, silence was strategy. I looked at Quenric and then at Morwenna, my smile steady, but my eyes memorizing the moment. Laughter can be crueler than insults. It legitimizes them, makes them acceptable. Families often excuse disrespect by disguising it as humor. And the damage? It lingers long after the joke ends. I sipped from my cup, steadying myself, letting the sting transform into something sharper. Resolve. Later, as the night wound down, I stacked paper plates and gathered utensils, slipping into the quiet rhythm of cleaning while the others lingered with stories near the fire pit. The scrape of plates, the faint buzz of insects, the smell of ash from the grill. It all gave me space to think. I thought about the hospital, about how no one there questioned my authority when a patient was in pain, when decisions mattered. Yet here, in my own family, I was perpetually the outsider, the childless one, the one cropped out of the picture. Respect isn't begged, I whispered under my breath as I carried dishes inside. It's earned, but in this family, my currency never counted. I noticed Veratus, our brother, watching me from the edge of the yard. He said nothing, but his eyes carried something, maybe sympathy, maybe guilt. He always skirted the battles, preferring silence to conflict. Still, I saw it, a flicker of recognition that I wasn't wrong. I smiled, not the smile of surrender, but the kind you wear when you know patience will serve you better than fury. The kind of smile that says, I'll wait, I'll remember, and when the time is right, I'll act. As I closed the back door behind me, carrying the last of the dishes, I felt it deep in my chest. This wasn't the end of a small slight. It was the beginning of a pattern unraveling. I smiled that night, but it wasn't agreement. It was the beginning of my plan. The weekend air had already started to cool, the hint of fall whispering through Des Moines. The leaves were turning, not yet fully red or gold, but enough to remind everyone summer was over. My sister suggested we all go out for dinner at a family diner on the edge of town. She called it a neutral space, as if family feuds could be softened by booths and laminated menus. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The diner was buzzing with voices and the clatter of silverware. The smell of fried chicken and coffee lingered in the air, blending with the faint music from an old jukebox in the corner. Families crowded the booths, servers weaving between tables carrying plates of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and steaming mugs. In small-town Iowa, diners weren't just about food. They were community stages where reputation was as visible as the check on the table. We slid into a booth near the window. Quenrick was already fidgeting, tapping a spoon against his glass, bouncing his knee under the table. He whined about the menu, flipping pages noisily, then loudly demanded pie before his meal. I tried to focus on the chatter around us, the sound of a waitress calling, "Order up," at the counter. But I knew the peace wouldn't last. The cracks were already showing in Morwenna's perfect performance. It didn't take long. As the waitress, a young woman maybe in her 20s, leaned over to refill our water glasses, Quenrick blurted out, "You're just a stupid loser." The diner went still. Conversations faltered, forks paused halfway to mouths. The waitress froze, the pitcher trembling slightly in her hand, before she quickly finished pouring and hurried to the next table without a word. I felt the burn rise in my chest, my hands tightened on my napkin. Around us, heads turned, eyes narrowed. In places like this, shame traveled faster than sound. "That's not how we talk to people who serve us, Quenrick," I said firmly, keeping my voice calm, my words even. "You owe her respect. Words matter, even more than you realize." Morwenna's fork clinked sharply against her plate. Her head snapped toward me, eyes flashing. "Don't make a scene, Athalie," she hissed. "He's just a kid. You don't get it." I stared at her, disbelief swelling. "Respect isn't optional," I answered steadily. "If he talks like this here, how will he speak to a teacher or a boss one day?" Her voice pitched higher, defensive, sharp enough to slice the room in two. "Better outspoken than walked over." The table around us grew silent, the weight of listening ears pressing in. I could feel the waitress avoiding our section now, her back stiff as she passed. My pride ached, not because of her words to me, but because every person in the diner now saw us as a family who excused disrespect. Inside, I reminded myself to breathe, but my stomach twisted. Silence returned to the table, punctuated only by Quenrick slurping his soda loudly, triumphant in the chaos he had created. Later that night, back in my own home, I sat on the couch with the glow of my phone lighting my face. Against my better instincts, I opened Facebook. And there it was. Morwenna had posted a series of photos from the diner. The table was full, her smile wide, Quenric leaning against her shoulder. But I wasn't in the frame. I recognized the crop instantly. My arm was half visible at the edge of one picture, cut away like I didn't exist. Her caption read, "Family time, nothing like teaching our kids to speak their mind." The words slammed into me harder than her dismissive tone earlier. In this town, sometimes the photo became the truth, and when you weren't in the picture, people acted as if you'd never been there at all. I scrolled down. Friends and neighbors left comments. "Beautiful family. Such strong values you're teaching." Each one another knife, twisting deeper. They weren't praising truth. They were praising her rewrite of reality. I put the phone down, staring at the ceiling. This digital erasure cut sharper than any public embarrassment at the diner. Words fade, but images linger. The picture was her narrative, and she was the author. I was just edited out. I wanted to reply. I wanted to post the full picture, to write the truth. But my fingers hovered above the screen and stopped. I knew better. Engaging would only feed her story, make me look bitter, petty, like the jealous younger sister she whispered about behind closed doors. Instead, I closed the app, leaned back, and let the silence stretch. My silence isn't weakness, I thought, setting the phone on the table. It's the record I'm keeping. One day it will speak louder than her captions. Scrolling through my notifications, I noticed something small but striking. Veratus, our brother, had liked a post I made earlier in the week about a late shift at the hospital. It wasn't much, just a thumbs up buried in a sea of empty likes, but it reminded me I wasn't completely unseen. I turned off the lamp, leaving the room in shadows, and let the thought settle. Respect in this family had always been rationed, handed out sparingly, like bread during a famine. And for years, I'd been left hungry. But hunger, I knew, can turn into fuel. I whispered into the quiet of my living room, steady and certain. But one day, they'll realize I was always in the picture, whether they cropped me or not. The first snow had already dusted the streets of Des Moines, clinging to mailboxes and rooftops. Inside Morwenna's house, though, the fire snapped and popped, painting everything in a golden glow. She'd invited the family over for hot cocoa and games, calling it a cozy evening. On the surface, it was exactly that. Holiday decorations strung along the mantel, mugs of cocoa steaming in hands, the smell of cinnamon drifting through the living room. But beneath the surface, I felt the same undercurrent that had followed me since the summer, the exclusion that looked invisible to strangers but gnawed at me in every glance, every word. I sat on the couch, listening to the chatter. Our mother, Osmera, asked about Quenric's grades while stirring her drink slowly, as though the spoon could drown out the tension. Morwenna rattled off achievements, her voice pitched just high enough for me to hear the pride, but not the cracks in between. I sipped my cocoa, nodding where appropriate, but it felt like sitting in a room where laughter wasn't meant for me. They played cards at the dining table, and I joined, smiling politely, answering questions about the hospital. But I saw the subtle side eyes when I spoke too long. The evening hummed along as if everything were fine, but unease prickled at my skin. Later, as I slipped into the hallway to grab my coat, I paused at the sound of voices drifting from the kitchen. Morwenna's whisper carried clearly, her words deliberate. "Don't listen to your Aunt Athalie," she said to Quenric, her tone sharp but instructive. "She's just jealous, 'cause she has no family of her own." I froze, hand clenching my scarf. Quenric's laugh followed, light but cruel. "I know, Mom. You told me before." It hit me like ice water. This wasn't an offhand remark. This was repetition, indoctrination. I stood still, my breath caught in my throat. She wasn't just dismissing me in public anymore. She was actively planting the seed of disdain in her son, making sure he saw me as less, not equal. In that moment, clarity seared through me. This wasn't about one insult at a diner or one mocking at a barbecue. It was a deliberate erasure designed to reduce me to nothing in the eyes of the next generation. It wasn't just disrespect anymore, I thought, my pulse racing. It was erasure by indoctrination. I backed away quietly, forcing my steps light on the hardwood, as though catching them was worse than enduring it. When I returned to the living room, I forced a smile, joining in as they gathered for board games. The fire had burned lower, casting long shadows on the walls. We settled into chairs, and laughter trickled in again, surface laughter, polite, rehearsed. And then it came. "Hey, Aunt Athalie," Quenrick announced suddenly, loud enough for everyone to hear. His face was flushed from the heat of the fire, eyes sparkling with cruel confidence. "Nobody wants you. Mom says so." The room fell silent. Cards hit the table. All eyes turned to me. I felt the words pierce sharper than the diner scene, sharper than the cropped photo, because this time it wasn't whispered behind my back. It was flung into the open, a child's voice echoing his mother's venom. Morwenna pressed her lips together in a faint smirk, then feigned surprise. "Kids repeat things they don't mean," she said softly, a little too smoothly. My chest tightened, but my voice came out calm, steady. "Funny thing about words, Quenrick," I said, meeting his eyes. "Once they're spoken, they don't disappear. They stick." He shifted, uncomfortable for the first time. Around the table, Veritas glanced at me, his eyes heavy with sympathy, though he stayed silent, as always. The silence that followed was suffocating, every tick of the clock on the wall a reminder of what had just been revealed. Intergenerational damage, passed down like a cruel inheritance, sat in that room. And I was the witness. I left earlier than usual, pulling my coat tight against the cold as I stepped into the snow-covered street. The wind sliced through the night, my headlights carving a path through the darkness as I drove home. On the road, I thought about what had happened. Words cut deeper than actions, I realized. You can't crop someone out of blood, but you can try to erase them with whispers, with repetition, with poison fed in small doses to a child. The humiliation wasn't random anymore. It wasn't just a pattern of small slights. It was a campaign. As the snow thickened on my windshield, I gripped the steering wheel tighter. For years, I had chosen silence, choosing to hold peace rather than ignite battles. But that night, the silence turned heavy, almost unbearable. That night, I whispered to myself as I pulled into my driveway. I promised myself, the next cut would not come without consequence. The Christmas tree glowed in the corner of Morwenna's living room, lights blinking in rhythmic cheer, stockings hung neatly along the fireplace, the scent of pine and cinnamon weaving through the air. On the surface, everything looked like the kind of holiday picture families love to send in glossy cards. Everyone together, mugs of cider in hand, wrapping paper scattered around the floor. But beneath the laughter, I carried the sting of every whispered insult, every cropped photograph, every reminder that I was the outsider. I unwrapped the small gift Morwenna handed me, a scented candle with a label that read "Peaceful Nights." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give a stranger, not a sister. "Thought you'd like something simple," she said lightly. I thanked her, forcing warmth into my voice, though the gesture felt obligatory, not heartfelt. Around me, voices filled the room. Quenrick tore into his new video game, boasting to cousins about how his mom always got him the best stuff. Our mother, Osmera, rocked slowly in the armchair, commenting now and then, but mostly sipping her tea, eyes lowered. I felt the contrast more sharply than ever, holiday cheer wrapping around me like a too-tight sweater, while tension simmered beneath. The cracks came during dessert, when the conversation shifted to school. Morwenna sighed dramatically, fork resting against her pie plate. "Quenrick really needs a new iPad for his assignments," she announced, voice pitched high enough for everyone to hear. "But you know how expensive they are. With bills stacking up, it's a stretch." I stayed quiet, sipping cider. But then her eyes flicked to me, sharp, like a hawk circling prey. "Maybe you could help out, Athalie," she said smoothly. "You wouldn't understand since you don't have kids, but expenses pile up." The words landed like a slap. The room quieted, conversation stilled. I opened my mouth, but before I could answer, she added with a smirk, "It must be easy for you. No kids, no real responsibilities." My spine straightened. I set my glass down carefully, refusing to let my hand tremble. "I work double shifts at the hospital. I said firmly. Responsibility doesn't only come wrapped in diapers and homework. Responsibility is knowing lives depend on your choices every single day. Morwenna leaned back, unimpressed. It's not the same. Guests exchanged awkward glances. A cousin coughed into his napkin. Osmera kept stirring her tea, her silence speaking louder than any words. I felt humiliation flare hot in my chest, layered with anger, not only dismissed but dismissed publicly, turned into the family spectacle. I sat still, swallowing the ache. Around me, the buzz of conversation returned hesitantly, but the crack had split wider. Later in the evening, as wrapping paper lay crumpled underfoot and eggnog glasses crowded the coffee table, Quenric dashed across the room, bumping into the side table. A glass toppled, spilling eggnog across the new carpet. Before anyone could react, Morwenna snapped, "Athalie, if you hadn't distracted him, this wouldn't have happened." I froze, blinking at her in disbelief. What? I wasn't even near him. Her eyes were cold, daring me to protest. You were talking to him, weren't you? You pulled his attention. The absurdity of it struck deep, not because of the spill, but because she had turned an accident into another weapon to cut me down. It's never about the mess, I thought, pulse hammering. It's about making me the mess. I caught Veratus watching from across the room. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but he stayed quiet, as always, torn between defending me and keeping the peace. His silence, like our mother's, thickened the air. I knelt to grab a towel, pressing it into the carpet, my movements deliberate. The humiliation wasn't just hers anymore. It was everyone's silence that made it sting. As the night wound down, I stayed behind, helping to clean. My hands moved mechanically, folding boxes, tossing ribbons, scrubbing away eggnog stains, while my mind replayed every barb. An old saying surfaced in my thoughts. You can't control how others treat you, but you can control how long you let them. I realized then that my silence had been stretched thin. For years, I had chosen endurance over confrontation, telling myself it preserved peace. But peace wasn't what lived in this house. It was manipulation, dressed in tinsel and family tradition. I carried the last trash bag to the porch, the cold Iowa air biting at my cheeks. Snowflakes drifted down, soft but relentless, covering the ground in white. My heart felt colder than the wind as I pulled my coat tight. I whispered to myself, steady as the snow fell, the next strike won't just bruise my pride, it will test the limits of my silence. I knew I shouldn't have gone. After Christmas, I promised myself I'd step back, put some distance between me and the steady stream of humiliation that had become routine. But when Morwenna sent the message, we're having a little dinner with family and a few friends, it would mean a lot if you came, I felt cornered. Declining would only feed her narrative that I was bitter, detached, unwilling to be part of the family. So I said yes, though I walked into her house that spring evening with my guard up. Warm lights filled the dining room, candles flickering on the table, plates of roast chicken, potatoes, and green beans steamed under the glow, and glasses of wine reflected back like jewels. On the surface, it was welcoming. Conversations flowed easily, cousins asking about work, neighbors sharing stories about kids graduating, but beneath it, I felt the same hostility I'd grown used to. Smiles too wide, pauses too sharp. I sat down, answering questions politely. The hospital's been busy, I said, offering details about late shifts, patients recovering. People nodded, some listening, some distracted. Across the table, Morwenna's smile stretched, and I recognized it instantly. Not warmth, but anticipation. The trap came with the shift of a single comment. One of the guests, a family friend, lifted her glass toward Morwenna. You're doing such a good job raising Quenric. He's bright, confident. Clearly, he has a strong mother. Morwenna's eyes flicked to me like a blade finding its mark. She let out a small laugh, then said, Of course, Athalie wouldn't understand. She's not a real parent. The words echoed through the dining room. Forks paused. A couple of guests gasped softly. My chest tightened, as if the air had been sucked out. I set my glass down with care, refusing to let it shake. My voice came out steady, sharper than the edge of her smile. Being a parent isn't the only way to know responsibility. Respect doesn't require children, it requires character. Her smirk deepened. That's just theory, Athalie. Until you raise a child yourself, you're just guessing. The silence that followed was heavier than the food on the table. Every eye was on me, waiting to see if I'd flinch, if I'd fold. Inside, I felt stripped bare, as if my life, my career, my sacrifices, my very existence was meaningless in the measure of family because it didn't include motherhood. I breathed in, long and slow, refusing to let the heat rise to my cheeks. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every woman I'd ever known dismissed because she didn't fit the mold. The conversation limped forward after that, but the air stayed poisoned. It should have ended there. But humiliation in Morwena's hands never rested. Later, as dessert plates clinked and coffee was poured, Quenric leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Why would anyone listen to you, Aunt Athalie?" he asked loudly, voice carrying across the table. "You don't even have kids." The sting was sharp, not because of the boy's words, but because they were echoes, an inheritance passed from his mother. Guests shifted uncomfortably, one neighbor muttering, "That's not honesty, that's rudeness." Morwena chuckled, shrugging. "He's just being honest." I looked straight at the boy, my voice calm, deliberate. If honesty means tearing people down, then I'd rather stay silent. The words dropped into the silence, rippling through the room. Conversations faltered, glances darted between me and Morwena. My calmness unsettled more than if I had shouted. Inside, I thought, children don't invent cruelty, they inherit it. And here it was, passed down like a family heirloom. As the evening wound down, I withdrew from conversation, letting silence settle around me like armor. My silence wasn't surrender. It was deliberate, heavy, a weight that everyone could feel, but no one could name. Guests began to leave, their goodbyes awkward, some squeezing my shoulder with sympathy, others avoiding my eyes. Veratus lingered near the door, giving me a look that said he understood more than he would ever say out loud. I carried my coat to the entryway, my mind steady, my heart colder than the spring rain falling outside. Silence is not weakness. It's the pause before a storm. That night, as I drove home under the streetlights, I made a decision. If Morwena wanted a war, she would learn something important about me. I don't fight with words. I fight with truth. The church hall buzzed with chatter and the clatter of folding chairs being dragged into neat rows. Outside, spring rain had washed the air clean, but inside, the room smelled of coffee, fresh pastries, and floor polish. Bright posters about health and community care lined the walls. I had been invited to speak about a new wellness initiative from the hospital, a small recognition of my work. In a town like ours, that stage wasn't just wood and lights, it was reputation carved into memory. Everyone knew everyone here, and what was seen became truth. I smoothed my blouse as I walked toward the stage, clutching the note cards I barely needed. My mind wasn't on the speech, but on the undercurrent. Morwena had arrived earlier with Quenric, weaving among the tables like royalty greeting subjects. She laughed too loudly, shook hands with the pastor, and let her son run freely between tables, knocking into chairs and drawing indulgent smiles from those charmed by spirited children. As I adjusted the microphone, I caught Morwena's eyes across the room. She was smiling, but it wasn't encouragement. It was the same warning I'd seen too many times. You're not one of us, no matter what stage you stand on. I breathed deeply, reminding myself why I was here. This was supposed to be neutral ground, a chance to be seen for what I contributed, not what I lacked. Still, the tightness in my chest told me danger was near. I began to speak, my voice steady, as I explained the new outreach program for seniors struggling with chronic illness. A few heads nodded in appreciation, others leaned in, listening. But before I could finish my second point, Quenric's voice sliced through the hall. "Shut up already!" he shouted, loud enough to echo. The room froze. Forks clattered against plates. A murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by a hush so complete I could hear my own pulse. I steadied myself, forcing calm into my words. "Words matter, Quenric. This isn't the place." Before I could finish, Morwena's voice cut across the silence, pitched for maximum effect. From her seat, she called, "See? Even my kid knows better than you." A nervous chuckle spread unevenly among the tables, the kind of laughter people use to cover discomfort. Some glanced at me with pity, Others looked away entirely, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. My face remained still, but inside I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Here I was, on a stage to share something meant to serve the community, and in 2 sentences, she had turned it into a spectacle. I forced myself to keep going, voice calm, though my hands gripped the lectern hard enough to ache. "I heal strangers every day," I whispered to myself so low no one else could hear. "Yet in my own family, I am torn down by blood." I wrapped up the speech quickly, applause polite but thin, the sting of humiliation hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. When the event ended, I slipped out into the cool night air, coat pulled tight against the damp breeze. The parking lot was nearly empty, but I heard footsteps approaching. It was Veritas. He stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, glancing at me with a kind of awkward care. "You did the right thing, Athalie," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the showmanship of our sister. "Don't let them twist you." For a moment, the knot in my chest loosened. His words were plain, but they landed with more weight than Morwenna's spectacle. It was the first time in a long time someone in this family had said out loud what I knew to be true. I nodded, my voice steadier than I felt. "One truth, spoken softly, can weigh more than 100 lies shouted." He gave a faint smile, then patted my shoulder before walking toward his car. I stood there for a while, the sound of rain dripping from the eaves mixing with the faint hum of traffic. His words anchored me, keeping me from sinking into despair. At home that night, I sat by my window, looking out at the slick streets reflecting the glow of street lamps. The humiliation replayed in my mind, the laughter, the pitying looks, but so did Veritas's quiet validation. It was enough to remind me that silence wasn't surrender. I remembered an old American saying, "What is right is not always popular, and what is popular is not always right." Morwenna had the crowd's laughter. I had the truth. I chose silence, not as weakness, but as a weapon I would sharpen until the moment came to use it. I wouldn't fight fire with fire. I would fight with facts, with evidence no one could laugh off. I leaned back in my chair, a faint smile curving my lips, and little did they know I had already begun collecting what I needed. The summer sun had begun its slow descent, leaving streaks of orange and pink across the Iowa sky. Morwenna's backyard was alive with chatter, the smell of grilled chicken mingling with the sweetness of baked beans and corn on the cob. The picnic tables were lined with checkered cloths, pitchers of lemonade, and bowls of fruit salad. To anyone passing by, it looked like a picture-perfect family cookout. But I had learned long ago that Morwenna's gatherings were never just about food or fellowship. They were stages, and she was always the lead actress. She floated from guest to guest with her perfected smile, praising Quenrick's wit and confidence as he darted around the yard, already beginning to grate on the nerves of the guests. His voice carried louder than the others, but each time someone looked uneasy, Morwenna laughed it off. "He's just full of energy," she told them, brushing away complaints before they formed. I sat under the shade of the maple tree, watching her orchestrate the image. I couldn't help but think, performances are convincing until the curtain slips. And tonight, I could sense that slip coming. The curtain fell faster than I expected. Quenrick's friend, a lanky boy with shaggy hair, pulled out his phone to show a video. He must have forgotten the volume was all the way up, because suddenly the yard was filled with the unmistakable sound of Quenrick's voice. On the small screen, there he was, standing in a school hallway, cursing at his teacher, calling him names I wouldn't repeat. Laughter followed on the recording, not just from the other boys, but from Quenrick himself. Then his voice rang clear. "My mom says it's fine. She even laughs." The guests shifted uncomfortably. Conversations died mid-sentence. I felt my heart slam against my ribs. Proof. Raw and undeniable. Proof that she didn't just excuse his behavior, she condoned it. Morwenna's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she swooped in, clapping her hands dramatically. "All right, boys, enough screens. Go grab dessert before it's all gone," she said, her voice louder than necessary. The boys scrambled, embarrassed, and the phone disappeared into a pocket. The moment slipped by, at least for everyone else. Guests chuckled nervously, trying to reset the mood, but I sat frozen, every detail etched into my mind. There it was, I thought, watching her mask snap back into place. Truth, raw and undeniable, and still, silence covered it like a blanket. I didn't say a word. Not yet. I let her performance resume, but this time I was watching not as her sister, but as a witness gathering evidence. Later that night, the evidence came straight to me. I was at home when my phone buzzed with a message from a mutual friend. "I thought you should see this," the text read, followed by a screenshot. It was from a group chat. Morwena's name lit the top. My eyes scanned the words, each one tightening the knot in my stomach. "Athalie is bitter. She'll never know real life like I do with Quenric." And below that, another message. "I let him speak his truth, no matter how rude. Better than being weak." The sting was immediate, but sharper than pain was clarity. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't hearsay. It was her own words, documented in black and white. She hadn't just whispered these thoughts behind doors, she had published them to an audience, daring anyone to disagree. I sat back on the couch, staring at the glow of the screen. In small towns, gossip spreads faster than wildfire. But this wasn't rumor. This was testimony. Her own. Disbelief washed through me, then slowly hardened into something else. Power. Words could be dismissed when spoken, denied when repeated. But written, captured, screenshotted, they became evidence. I saved the screenshot, my hands calm now, not shaking. This wasn't the wound she thought she inflicted, it was the weapon she had handed me. The next day, I began what I hadn't dared to do before, building a record. I pulled up every file I had, every message, every clipped memory that had left me humiliated. The video from the cookout, the screenshots of her posts cropping me out of family photos, the chat leak she hadn't imagined would leave her circle. I cataloged them carefully, folder by folder, each piece fitting into the puzzle of a story I'd kept silent far too long. I remembered an old American proverb, one my father used to repeat before arguments at church council meetings. "The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine." That night, as I sat at my desk, papers and files stacked neatly beside my laptop, I felt the truth of those words in my bones. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my refusal to argue was surrender. But silence, when armed with evidence, is sharper than shouting. The longer they thought I was powerless, the sharper the cut would be when truth finally spoke. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the glowing screen, heart steady. They handed me the rope, I thought, fingers brushing over the files. All I have to do is decide when to pull. And in the quiet of that summer night, as laughter from distant fireworks echoed across the neighborhood, I knew one thing for certain. Soon, the silence I carried would roar louder than their laughter. The midsummer air clung heavy around Osmera's house, cicadas buzzing in the background as relatives and neighbors trickled in with pies, casseroles, and trays of fruit. This was the largest gathering of the year, our annual reunion. The yard filled quickly, children darting between folding chairs while uncles fired up the grill. Laughter rose and fell like waves, but beneath it, I felt the undercurrent pressing against me. I carried a bowl of salad inside, weaving through the kitchen where aunts arranged dishes. Their chatter quieted briefly when I entered, then rose again in forced cheer. I wasn't imagining it. I knew the eyes that followed me, the silent calculations. My absence from photographs and captions had done its job. Some saw me less as family, more as a background character. Across the yard, Morwena paraded Quenric proudly, retelling stories of his boldness as though disrespect were a virtue. Her voice carried, loud and polished, each anecdote burnishing her role as the perfect mother. I watched, arms crossed loosely, feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. Tonight felt like a turning point. And in small towns, I knew the stage didn't always come with lights. Sometimes the brightest stage was built from gossip and glances. The conversation about Quenric's school trouble surfaced during dinner. A cousin, unaware of the minefield, asked lightly, "So I heard there was some issue at school last month?" Morwenna waved her hand, laughter bubbling too quickly. Kids will be kids. You know how teachers exaggerate. The table chuckled politely, but I set my fork down, steadying my voice. Not when their teachers have video evidence. The air thinned. A few relatives shifted, eyes flicking from me to her. I continued, calm, deliberate. I've shared clips and screenshots with the school, and with some of you here. They speak for themselves. Murmurs rippled through the room. A couple of relatives nodded slightly, others avoided my eyes. For the first time, Morwenna's smile faltered. She blinked, recalibrating, realizing that whispers had already spread against her carefully crafted image. I sat straighter, my voice measured. I didn't need to shout. Truth has been working in silence, carrying its own weight. The silence didn't last. It never did with her. Morwenna leaned forward, eyes narrowing, voice laced with accusation. So you've been plotting behind my back, sharing private things. That's betrayal, Athalie. Family doesn't do that. I inhaled, calm and cold, then reached into my bag. The envelope slid across the table with a quiet finality. This isn't betrayal, I said, my voice steady. This is record. The envelope landed between us. Relatives leaned closer as I opened it, spreading out printed screenshots, video transcripts, receipts, years of evidence. Payments I'd made when she claimed she covered things alone, text messages where she mocked me while taking my help, proof of every time she'd twisted truth into a weapon. Gasps broke around the table, papers shuffled, whispers rose. You told me I shouldn't lecture your child, I said, eyes locked on hers. You were right. These papers will. The room fell into stunned silence. Morwenna's face drained of color, then flushed hot. She stammered, These are taken out of context. You're twisting. But the evidence lay plain. No performance could rewrite what was printed. Relatives exchanged glances, some in shock, some with quiet satisfaction, as though truths they had long suspected finally had form. The only sounds were the shuffle of papers and the murmurs spreading like a wave. I kept my tone even, each word deliberate. Respect isn't begged, it's earned. And tonight, truth earns mine back. Her lips trembled, eyes darting between the faces around her. For once, her voice failed her. The aftermath was heavy. Morwenna sat speechless, hands frozen above the damning pages. Quenric, wide-eyed, looked between his mother and me, confusion breaking through his usual arrogance. Veratus caught my gaze from across the table, his nod small but certain. A silent confirmation. He saw me, finally. Osmera, our mother, stared into her lap, avoiding everyone's eyes, her teacup untouched. I rose first, pushing back my chair with quiet resolve. I didn't wait for applause. I didn't need it. As I walked toward the door, I felt the silence behind me expand, louder than any defense she could muster. Inside my chest, words settled like stone. I didn't win applause. I didn't need to. I left them with silence, and silence has a long memory. I pulled on my coat, the night air cooler than the heavy room I left behind. One truth had landed, but I knew truths were never gentle. Truth doesn't just wound, it demands consequence. And those consequences were only beginning. It was late summer when the first call came. I was at the hospital finishing a shift when my phone buzzed with a text from a friend on the school board. It's official. Suspension. You were right. I didn't need to ask who they were talking about. Quenric. By the time I got home, the news had already begun to ripple across town. The middle school had finally had enough. After repeated warnings, complaints from parents, and the video evidence I'd quietly provided, they suspended him. The decision was not just about one incident, it was about a pattern. His outbursts, his language, the way he had thrown disrespect around like it was his birthright. Morwenna stormed into the principal's office that morning, her voice rising so high that teachers in nearby classrooms could hear. This is targeting. My son is being punished because people don't like me, she had snapped. But her protests fell flat against the documented record. Teachers' reports, parents' complaints, and the undeniable videos. I imagined her face when she realized it wasn't hearsay anymore. It was fact. In America, schools don't just teach children, they hold parents accountable too. Watching her spin and fail was vindication. Relief mingled with gravity. This wasn't just punishment for a child, it was exposure for her. The details spread quickly. That week, I heard about the outburst that tipped the balance. Quenric had cursed at a teacher in class, then hurled a chair when asked to leave. Other students pulled out phones, recording every second. By the next morning, the clips were making the rounds among parents, shared in whispers and in group chats. I sat with my coffee one evening, phone buzzing with messages from friends forwarding me the video. His voice rang out sharp, his words so vile that even seasoned teachers looked shaken. I didn't need to watch the whole thing. I'd seen enough. When Morwenna showed up at my door later, her eyes were wild. "You did this," she spat. "You fed them everything. You want to see me humiliated." I looked her straight in the eyes. "I didn't put those words in his mouth. I didn't throw the chair. That was his choice, and your teaching." Her face reddened. "He's being targeted because of me. You know this town. People resent me. They're jealous. They're punishing him to get to me." I shook my head. "Excuses are bandages on wounds that never heal, Morwenna. You've been covering up for him so long you can't tell the difference between consequence and conspiracy." That night, we sat for a tense family meeting. Osmera looked down at her hands, her disappointment written across her silence. Veratis leaned back in his chair, eyes shifting between us, lips pressed thin as though weighing whether to speak. He didn't, but his silence didn't shield her anymore. It judged her. What happened next spread far beyond the school. Once admired, Morwenna began to feel the chill of community judgment. At church, people avoided eye contact, their greetings clipped and brief. In the grocery store, neighbors who once fawned over her now turned their carts quickly down other aisles. Invitations to dinners and playdates evaporated. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was open distance. Online, in neighborhood Facebook groups, parents posted their opinions. If you let your child curse at adults, don't be surprised when the world says no. Another wrote, "Children learn what they live. Maybe she should have been less proud of his disrespect." I read the threads late at night, not with glee, but with quiet observation. Truth has a way of traveling. You don't have to force it, it moves on its own legs. One evening, sitting with Veridis on the porch, he spoke softly, almost as if testing the words on his tongue. "You didn't have to lift a finger," he said, handing me a bottle of water. "They're undoing themselves." I met his eyes, steady. That was always the point. Let them speak. Let them act. The truth doesn't need me to shout. It needs me to remember. Morwenna felt the humiliation with every step she took in public, but still tried to bluff her way through. Her posts grew more defensive, more desperate. "People don't understand how hard parenting is," she wrote, but the comments undercut her, neighbors no longer willing to nod along. As summer waned and the nights cooled, I sat by my window, thinking about all of it. Respect isn't begged, it's earned. And sometimes, once it's lost, it can never be repaired. Community judgment cuts sharper than family fights. Families argue, forgive, move on. But when a town turns its back, it rarely turns again. That was the consequence she never prepared for. I didn't gloat, I didn't celebrate, I simply understood. This wasn't revenge, it was truth doing its work. And I knew my shield wasn't anger. It was evidence, it was silence, it was patience. Still, as I watched the shadows lengthen outside my window, I knew something else too. Even as the community turned its back on Morwenna, the final confrontation still waited. Not in public, but at home, across the same kitchen table where so many words had already been whispered. And I was ready. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, the kind of quiet that pressed down on your shoulders. The day after the community turned on her, Morwenna called and asked me to come over. That alone was strange. Our battles had always been public, with an audience to watch her cut me down. This invitation, to sit alone across her kitchen table, carried a weight that made me hesitate. But I went, curiosity and caution walking beside me. Her kitchen was dimly lit, the overhead bulb casting a pale glow on the wood table between us. She had set out 2 mugs of tea, steam rising faintly, though the silence between us was colder than the autumn air outside. I pulled out a chair, its legs scraping across the tile louder than either of us spoke. "Thanks for coming," she said finally, her voice softer than I'd expected. I nodded. "You wanted to talk." She folded her hands around the mug, eyes downcast. For a moment, I thought maybe this was it, the crack in the armor, the moment of honesty. In America, wars aren't always fought in front of crowds. Sometimes they end in kitchens, across tables meant for family. The air hummed with unsaid things as I waited. Vulnerability lingered, thin but present, and against my own judgment, I felt a flicker of hope. It came in the form of tears. Morwenna's voice cracked as she leaned forward. "I'm exhausted, Athalie. I don't know what to do with him anymore. The suspension, the whispers, the looks at church, it's crushing me." I studied her carefully, watching the way her shoulders sagged. For a moment, she wasn't the queen of the room. She was a mother unraveling, looking for relief. "You know I've always been here," I said gently, helping even when no one noticed. The nights I stayed late to tutor him, the times I slipped money into his backpack for supplies, the babysitting when you had meetings. "I've been here." Her eyes lifted to mine, wet but sharp, and in an instant, the warmth vanished. "You didn't do much," she said, her tone icy. "I handled everything. You think showing up once in a while counts? Don't rewrite history." I blinked, stunned. "Morwenna, I'm not rewriting anything. I was there. I carried pieces you didn't want to admit you dropped." She pushed her chair back slightly, the scrape harsh against the tile. "You've always made yourself the victim, but I'm the one who's had to bear the real weight. You don't know what it's like to actually be responsible." Her words cut cleaner than any public insult had. Denial wasn't new, but hearing it face to face, after years of quiet sacrifice, turned betrayal into something colder. Inside my chest, something shifted. Not rage, not even grief, cold clarity. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch until it became its own presence. My mind replayed every time I'd stepped in. Late-night phone calls, errands run on my lunch breaks, groceries dropped at her door. Each moment dismissed, erased, claimed as her own effort. It was then I realized she hadn't invited me for reconciliation. She hadn't asked me to sit at this table for peace. She wanted validation, a witness to her suffering, not a partner in repair. I thought of an old saying I'd heard once: some people don't want help. They want witnesses to their suffering. That was Morwenna. Help was never the point. Recognition was. And because I had never begged for credit, she could erase me without guilt. Disappointment pooled heavy in my chest, but alongside it was acceptance, not the weak kind, the kind that hardens into resolve. I finished the last sip of my tea, setting the mug gently on the table. The steam had long gone, leaving the cup as cold as the space between us. Standing slowly, I slid the chair back and looked at her directly. "I won't beg for a place at this table," I said, my voice calm, even. "If silence is what you give me, then silence is what you'll remember." She blinked, lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. For once, she was the one left speechless. I walked to the door, slipping on my coat. The autumn wind cut sharp across my face as I stepped outside, but my steps were firm, steady. I didn't slam the door behind me. I left it open, not for her, but for the truth that was already walking in. Late autumn had settled over Des Moines, the wind scattering leaves in restless swirls across cracked sidewalks. I stood at the edge of Morwenna's driveway, the sky bruised with gray, the air cold enough to sting. My coat felt heavier than usual, not from weight, but from what I carried inside me. Tonight wasn't just another dinner, another clash. I knew it would be the last time I walked through her door as a sister, hoping for repair. Inside, the warmth of the house contrasted with the chill outside. Relatives gathered in muted clusters, voices hushed, plates filled but untouched. The air itself seemed to brace for what was coming. Osmera sat stiffly near the fireplace, Veratus leaning against the wall, arms folded. They weren't here for a meal. They were here for a reckoning. I drew in a steady breath. I wasn't walking into her house. I was walking into the courtroom of memory, with truth as my witness. and I was ready to testify. Morwenna entered the room, her posture still rehearsed, her hair pulled neatly back, smile just wide enough to feign control. She began with a sigh, addressing the relatives. "Let's not make this bigger than it is," she said, her voice calm, practiced. "Children stumble, communities gossip. I've been judged unfairly, but this family knows the truth. Don't let outsiders tear us apart." I felt every eye shift toward me, waiting. My pulse was steady now. "Outsiders didn't tear this family apart," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "You did the moment you taught your son to despise me." Her mask faltered, if only for a second. "You're exaggerating," she shot back, defensive now. "Why drag this into the open? You're tearing this family apart." "No," I said firmly. "I'm laying bare what's already broken. Pretending it isn't here won't heal it." The silence that followed was thick, heavy enough to make the floorboards creak louder. Relatives exchanged uneasy looks, some dropping their eyes. Truth doesn't always roar. It lingers, undeniable, in the air between words. I reached into my bag and pulled out the stack of papers I'd carried for months. Screenshots, video stills, transcripts, receipts. I placed them carefully on the table, spreading them like evidence in a trial. "You want truth?" I asked evenly. "Here it is." I pointed to the screenshots first. "Your words, Morwenna. Athalie is bitter. She'll never know real life like I do with Quenric. You wrote that. Not whispered, not twisted. You wrote it." Gasps came from around the room. Morwenna's cheeks flushed crimson. Then I tapped the video transcripts. "This is your son bragging that you laugh when he disrespects teachers. He said it himself. My mom says it's fine. And you let the world believe it was strength." Finally, I laid down the receipts. "And these, years of school supplies, groceries, bills, covered by me while you claimed you did it alone. You erased me, even in generosity." Morwenna's voice cracked as she tried to respond. "This is twisted. You're twisting everything." I met her eyes, unflinching. Respect isn't begged, it isn't borrowed, and it sure as hell isn't cropped out of a photo. The room went silent. Every eye weighed the truth spread out across the table. Morwenna's breath hitched, tears streaking her carefully composed face. For once, she had no script to follow. I straightened, my voice calm, declarative. "For years, I carried the weight you dropped, and for years, you told the world I was nothing. Tonight, I end that story. I won't play your scapegoat anymore." Morwenna broke then, shoulders shaking, face in her hands. Quenric sat stunned, confusion writ large as he stared at the evidence, the cracks in the narrative his mother had built crumbling before him. Verada stepped forward, his voice steady, quiet but undeniable. "She's right, we've all seen it, we just didn't want to admit it." Osmera, our mother, looked down at her lap, lips trembling. For the first time, her silence wasn't neutral, it was a burden, exposed. She could no longer pretend she hadn't seen. I felt no triumph in her tears, no glee in their discomfort. What I felt was something heavier but freeing. The satisfaction of truth unchained. When it was done, I gathered the papers calmly, tucking them back into my bag. I didn't slam the door on reconciliation, but I didn't leave it wide open either. The decision had already been made. I rose from my chair, the room still heavy with stunned silence. "I didn't win back my sister tonight," I said quietly. "But I won back myself." No one spoke as I walked to the door. The autumn air rushed against my face, crisp and cold, carrying with it the sound of leaves scattering across the pavement. I inhaled deeply, my lungs filling not with bitterness, but with release. Sometimes you win, not by staying, but by leaving with your dignity intact. As I stepped off the porch and into the night, I felt the closing of one story and the beginning of another. And I knew, with absolute clarity, this was the ending they wrote for me. But the beginning I wrote for myself. Late autumn had settled over Des Moines, the wind scattering leaves in restless swirls across cracked sidewalks. I stood at the edge of Morwenna's driveway, the sky bruised with gray, the air cold enough to sting. My coat felt heavier than usual, not from weight, but from what I carried inside me. Tonight wasn't just another dinner, another clash. I knew it would be the last time I walked through her door as a sister hoping for repair. Inside, the warmth of the house contrasted with the chill outside. Relatives gathered in muted clusters, voices hushed, plates filled, but untouched. The air itself seemed to brace for what was coming. Osmera sat stiffly near the fireplace, Veritas leaning against the wall, arms folded. They weren't here for a meal. They were here for a reckoning. I drew in a steady breath. I wasn't walking into her house. I was walking into the courtroom of memory, with truth as my witness. And I was ready to testify. Morwenna entered the room, her posture still rehearsed, her hair pulled neatly back, smile just wide enough to feign control. She began with a sigh, addressing the relatives. "Let's not make this bigger than it is," she said, her voice calm, practiced. "Children stumble. Communities gossip. I've been judged unfairly, but this family knows the truth. Don't let outsiders tear us apart." I felt every eye shift toward me, waiting. My pulse was steady now. "Outsiders didn't tear this family apart," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "You did the moment you taught your son to despise me." Her mask faltered, if only for a second. "You're exaggerating," she shot back, defensive now. "Why drag this into the open? You're tearing this family apart." "No," I said firmly. "I'm laying bare what's already broken. Pretending it isn't here won't heal it." The silence that followed was thick, heavy enough to make the floorboards creak louder. Relatives exchanged uneasy looks, some dropping their eyes. Truth doesn't always roar, it lingers, undeniable, in the air between words. I reached into my bag and pulled out the stack of papers I'd carried for months. Screenshots, video stills, transcripts, receipts. I placed them carefully on the table, spreading them like evidence in a trial. "You want truth?" I asked evenly. "Here it is." I pointed to the screenshots first. "Your words, Morwenna. Athalie is bitter. She'll never know real life like I do with Quenric. You wrote that, not whispered, not twisted. You wrote it." Gasps came from around the room. Morwenna's cheeks flushed crimson. Then I tapped the video transcripts. "This is your son bragging that you laugh when he disrespects teachers. He said it himself. My mom says it's fine. And you let the world believe it was strength." Finally, I laid down the receipts. "And these years of school supplies, groceries, bills, covered by me while you claimed you did it alone. You erased me, even in generosity." Morwenna's voice cracked as she tried to respond. "This is twisted. You're twisting everything." I met her eyes, unflinching. "Respect isn't begged, it isn't borrowed, and it sure as hell isn't cropped out of a photo." The room went silent. Every eye weighed the truth spread out across the table. Morwenna's breath hitched, tears streaking her carefully composed face. For once, she had no script to follow. I straightened, my voice calm, declarative. "For years, I carried the weight you dropped, and for years, you told the world I was nothing. Tonight, I end that story. I won't play your scapegoat anymore." Morwenna broke then, shoulders shaking, face in her hands. Quenric sat stunned, confusion writ large as he stared at the evidence, the cracks in the narrative his mother had built crumbling before him. Veritas stepped forward, his voice steady, quiet but undeniable. "She's right, we've all seen it. We just didn't want to admit it." Osmera, our mother, looked down at her lap, lips trembling. For the first time, her silence wasn't neutral. It was a burden, exposed. She could no longer pretend she hadn't seen. I felt no triumph in her tears, no glee in their discomfort. What I felt was something heavier but freeing, the satisfaction of truth unchained. When it was done, I gathered the papers calmly, tucking them back into my bag. I didn't slam the door on reconciliation, but I didn't leave it wide open either. The decision had already been made. I rose from my chair, the room still heavy with stunned silence. "I didn't win back my sister tonight," I said quietly. "But I won back myself." No one spoke as I walked to the door. The autumn air rushed against my face, crisp and cold, carrying with it the sound of leaves scattering across the pavement. I inhaled deeply, my lungs filling not with bitterness, but with release. Sometimes you win not by staying, but by leaving with your dignity intact. As I stepped off the porch and into the night, I felt the closing of one story and the beginning of another. And I knew with absolute clarity, this was the ending they wrote for me. But the beginning I wrote for myself.